The Federal Reserve controls the money supply of the United States. It sets interest rates. It decides how much money exists in circulation. It determines the financial fate of 330 million Americans. Most people assume it was designed by Congress, by elected officials in Washington, answerable to the public. That assumption is wrong. The Federal Reserve was designed by 7 men. They met in secret on a private island off the coast of Georgia, November 1910. So they traveled under fake names. They told no one where they were going. They called it a duck hunting trip. And when they arrived at the Jekyll Island Club, they spent 9 days writing the blueprint for what would become America's central bank. 6 of those 7 men worked directly for the 2 most powerful banking dynasties in the country, Morgan and Rockefeller. The 7th was a Republican senator. His daughter had married John D. Rockefeller, Jr. One of those men described what they did, in his own words, 25 years later. He wrote, "I was as secretive, indeed as furtive as any conspirator." His name was Frank Vanderlip, vice president of Rockefeller's National City Bank. He published those words in the Saturday Evening Post in 1935, in a national magazine. On the record, this is the story of what happened on that island, who was in that room, what they built, and why the institution they designed, over a century later, still operates by the same rules they wrote in secret. To understand why they met in secret, you need to understand what America looked like in 1907. There was no Federal Reserve, no central bank, no government body with the authority to stabilize the financial system. What existed was a loose network of private banks, each holding their own reserves, each operating by their own rules. In the autumn of 1907, that system fell apart. It started with a failed speculation. A copper trader named F. Augustus Hines tried to corner the copper market. He failed. He was connected to the Knickerbocker Trust, one of New York's largest financial institutions. Squin. Word spread. Depositors panicked. Within 48 hours, they had pulled $58 million from the Knickerbocker. The bank collapsed. The panic spread instantly. Within weeks, the New York Stock Exchange had lost nearly 50% of its value. 50%. In weeks. There was only one man with enough money to stop it, J.P. Morgan. Morgan called the heads of New York's major banks to his private library on Madison Avenue. He locked the doors, and he told them, "We will decide together who gets saved and who does not." The Knickerbocker Trust, he let it fail. Trust Company of America, a similar institution, similar distress. He chose to save it. No vote, no public oversight, no accountability. Morgan made the call. Let that land for a moment. The most severe financial crisis in a generation, stopped by one man in a private library with a locked door. Not Congress, not the government. One private banker decided who survived and who didn't. It's more powerful than before. When the panic ended, Morgan had consolidated control over dozens of failing institutions. He had demonstrated that the financial fate of America depended on the decisions of one private man. Congress responded. A congressional subcommittee was formed to investigate, called the Pujo Committee after its chairman, Congressman Arsen Pujo of Louisiana. Their 1913 report was damning. They found that through 341 interlocking directorships held in 112 corporations, the Morgan Rockefeller banking axis controlled resources valued at $22 billion. Senator Robert La Follette of Wisconsin took to the Senate floor with a warning. He said that 100 men controlled American industry, that through coordinated banking they had concentrated power no democracy should tolerate. 100 men. And Congress's solution was to put one of them in charge of fixing it. The term money trust entered the political vocabulary, and the pressure mounted for something that would look like reform. That pressure is exactly what the bankers had been waiting for. In 1908, Congress created the National Monetary Commission, tasked with studying the banking system and recommending reform. Senator Nelson Aldrich was appointed to lead it. Aldrich was not a neutral choice. He was one of the most powerful Republicans in the Senate. His daughter had recently married John D. Rockefeller, Jr., and he was known widely as a representative of Wall Street interests. He spent 2 years traveling Europe, studying the Bank of England, the German Reichsbank, the Banque de France. By late 1910, he had a plan. He needed to draft it, in complete secrecy, before the political window closed. Before we get into what happened next, quick question. If you already knew about the Panic of 1907 and J.P. Morgan's role in shaping the Federal Reserve, drop a $ in the comments. I want to know how many of you have been down this rabbit hole. The men who met at Jekyll Island were not a random collection of policy experts. They were the direct representatives of the two financial empires that controlled American finance. From the Morgan side, Henry P. Davison, J.P. Morgan's most trusted senior partner. Charles D. Norton, president of Morgan's First National Bank of New York. Benjamin Strong, who would later become the first head of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, the most powerful position in the entire system. From the Rockefeller side, Frank Vanderlip, vice president of Rockefeller's National City Bank. Senator Nelson Aldrich, whose daughter had married into the Rockefeller family. The seventh man was the technical architect, Paul Warburg, a partner at Kuhn, Loeb and Company. Born in Hamburg, Germany, had spent years studying European central banking, and he believed America needed the same structure. They used first names only, no surnames, no titles. They boarded Aldrich's private rail car in New Jersey, one man at a time, to avoid being seen together. They arrived at Jekyll Island under cover of a hunting party. For 9 days they worked, and what they produced was the Aldrich Plan, a complete blueprint for an American central bank. Now here is the part that mainstream accounts consistently understate. In 1912, the Aldrich Plan was presented to Congress. It was rejected. The progressive movement saw through it immediately. This was a banker's plan, written by bankers. For bankers, Senator La Follette called it exactly what it was. The public had been demanding reform, not institutionalized banker control, dressed up as reform. So the plan was repackaged. The technical infrastructure remained almost identical. Reserve requirements, interest rate mechanisms, the structure of currency issuance, word for word in places. But the political structure changed. A Democratic senator, Carter Glass of Virginia, was brought in. The bill was renamed. It was now called the Glass-Owen Federal Reserve Act. It now appeared to be a progressive reform, a Democratic victory against Wall Street. Frank Vanderlip wrote about this strategy directly in the Saturday Evening Post in 1935. He explained that the plan could not bear the Aldrich name, that Aldrich had become, his words, a term of reproach, that it had to be disguised before Congress would accept it. And then came the timing. December 22, 1913. 3 days before Christmas. The House passed the bill minus 298 votes to 60. December 23rd. The Senate voted minus 43 to 25. Most senators had already left Washington for the Christmas holiday. President Woodrow Wilson signed the Federal Reserve Act into law at 6 p.m. that same evening. Congressman Charles Lindbergh, father of the famous aviator, stood on the House floor as the vote was called. He said this, "When the president signs this bill, the invisible government by the monetary power will be legalized. And this act establishes the most gigantic trust on earth." He was voted out of Congress after the next election. Not one of the men who wrote the plan at Jekyll Island was ever required to testify publicly about what had happened on that island. If this kind of financial history is new to you, this is what we do at Empire Verdict. Every video. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Here is the paradox that has lived inside the Federal Reserve since its founding. The Fed presents itself as a public institution, a government agency. Its chairman is appointed by the president, confirmed by the Senate. But the 12 Federal Reserve banks that constitute the system, they are not owned by the government. They are owned by their member banks. Private banks. The same class of institutions that sent representatives to Jekyll Island. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York, the most powerful in the system, counts J.P. Morgan Chase, Citibank, and Goldman Sachs among its shareholders. This structure has produced consequences. In 1929, the stock market crashed. The Federal Reserve, rather than injecting money to stabilize the system, raised interest rates. It contracted the money supply. Between 1929 and 1933, the United States money supply shrank by 1/3. Economists Milton Friedman and Anna Schwartz documented this in their landmark 1963 study, A Monetary History of the United States. It's their finding. Federal Reserve rate hikes turned a stock market crash into a decade-long depression. At the peak of the Great Depression, 1 in 4 American workers had no job. In 2008, the pattern ran the other direction. The financial system was collapsing, caused in large part by mortgage instruments created and sold by the major banks. The Federal Reserve responded with extraordinary speed. Goldman Sachs received $10 billion from the government rescue program. J.P. Morgan Chase received $25 billion. Citigroup received $45 billion. The homeowners who held the mortgages those banks had written, most of them lost their houses. In 2020, during the COVID pandemic, the Federal Reserve expanded its balance sheet by $3 trillion in 6 months. Over the same period, the combined wealth of American billionaires grew by $1.3 trillion. You decide if that is a coincidence. Let's step back and look at what we actually know. I want to be precise here. This is an analysis of institutional design and documented outcomes, not an indictment of any group, ethnicity, or religion. The men at Jekyll Island were institutional actors representing specific financial interests. History doesn't need conspiracy theories to be disturbing. The documented record is disturbing enough. A genuine financial crisis existed in 1907. Serious economists have defended aspects of the Fed's design, and yet these are also facts. 7 men, representing institutions that controlled a quarter of the world's wealth, traveled under fake names to a private island. They wrote a banking reform bill. When Congress rejected that bill because it was too obviously written by bankers, they repackaged it, gave it a new name, and passed it in the final days before Christmas, while the Senate chamber was half empty. Today, the Federal Reserve still operates without a full congressional audit. The Federal Reserve Transparency Act has been introduced in Congress more than a dozen times since 2009. It has never passed. The men who met on Jekyll Island are gone. But the institution they designed, private bank ownership, insulation from democratic oversight, remains exactly as they built it. In 1913, they called it reform. In 2026, we are still debating whether the public has the right to see how it works. The verdict on the Federal Reserve: 7 private bankers, representing the 2 most powerful financial dynasties in American history, designed America's monetary system in secret on a private island, repackaged it as a reform bill when Congress rejected the original, passed it on December 23, 1913, while the Senate was leaving for Christmas, and built into it a structure of private ownership that has never been subject to full public audit. Next, we're looking at the Opium Wars. 2 military conflicts Britain launched not to defeat an enemy in battle, but to force a nation to buy their drugs. And the private company that issued the order. If you made it this far, you already know more than most. Subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.